The morning air in San Diego carried the salt-tinged scent of the Pacific Ocean mixed with the blooming jacaranda flowers that painted Balboa Park in shades of purple every spring. Margaret Torres walked slowly along the winding pathways, her weathered hand gripping her wooden cane with white-knuckled determination. At 70 years old, she had never imagined that moving through the world would require such deliberate effort, such conscious negotiation with her own body. The arthritis that had once been an occasional ache in her knees had evolved into something far more demanding, a constant companion that whispered its presence with every step, every movement, every attempt at the simple act of being alive. She had arrived at Balboa Park at 7 in the morning, deliberately choosing the early hours when the paths would be less crowded, when she wouldn't have to navigate around joggers and cyclists and cheerful young families with their effortless mobility. The solitude was comforting in its own way, though Margaret recognized with the clarity that comes only from years of experience that comfort and loneliness were often dancing partners, inseparable and indistinguishable. 3 years. It had been 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days since George had died. Not that Margaret was counting, except she was. She counted every single day, the mornings when she woke and forgot for just a moment that he was gone, and then the crushing remembrance that crashed down upon her like a wave. She counted the holidays that felt hollow without his terrible jokes and his warm presence. She counted the nights when the silence in their house, his house, really, the one they'd bought together 42 years ago, became so profound that she could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, a lonely rhythm that seemed to be asking why it continued to beat at all. The doctor had been insistent during her last appointment. Dr. Patricia Reeves was a woman who didn't mince words, and she had looked at Margaret over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that was part concern and part exasperation. "Movement heals, Margaret," she'd said firmly, tapping her pen against the desk as if to emphasize each word. "Your body needs it. Your mind needs it. Your spirit needs it. You're deteriorating, not from the arthritis alone, but from inactivity, from isolation, from grief that's become a comfortable prison." The words had stung because they were true. Margaret knew she had been withdrawing inch by inch, day by day, into a smaller and smaller version of herself. Her daughter called less frequently now, not out of malice, but because the conversations had become strained, filled with Margaret's monosyllabic responses and unspoken accusations that her daughter had moved on with her life, had found happiness, had somehow betrayed George by continuing to live fully. Margaret knew this wasn't fair. She knew her daughter was doing her best, but grief, Margaret was learning, was not a rational emotion. It consumed logic and fairness and perspective and replaced them with a hollow ache that colored everything. So here she was, shuffling through Balboa Park like a ghost haunting the living world. The doctor had prescribed walks, 20 minutes minimum, 4 times per week. Margaret had negotiated it down to 3 times per week, though lately she'd been coming more often, not from any sudden burst of motivation, but because the house had become unbearable. The walls seemed to press in on her. Every object, every photograph, every corner held memories of George. George teaching their grandson to throw a baseball in the backyard. George's reading glasses still sitting on the nightstand because Margaret couldn't bring herself to move them. George's laughter echoing from 1,000 conversations that would never happen again. She paused on one of the benches, the one near the rose garden that was just beginning to bloom. Her knees throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, trying to follow the meditation technique that Dr. Reeves had taught her. Feel the pain without judgment. Observe it. Don't fight it. Let it be. But Margaret had never been good at acceptance. She had always been a fighter, fighting against her working-class background to become a nurse, fighting against her parents' disapproval of George, fighting to raise 2 children while working night shifts and somehow still managing to keep her family together. That fighting spirit had served her well for 67 years, but it was failing her now. How do you fight against your own body? How do you fight against grief? How do you fight against the simple, Terrible fact that the person you loved most in the world was gone, and you were still here. She opened her eyes and began to walk again, pushing herself to move a little further than yesterday, trying to establish some pattern of improvement that might convince her that her life still had direction. Her cane tapped against the pavement in a rhythmic pattern, tap, shuffle, a percussion accompaniment to her solitary march through the park. That's when she saw him. He was sitting on a bench about 30 yards ahead of her, the bench that overlooked the Japanese Friendship Garden. He was a large man, broad-shouldered with the kind of posture that spoke of military training, shoulders back, spine straight even while sitting. He looked to be somewhere in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of tan that came from outdoor work rather than vacation. His face was angular and strong, but it was his eyes that arrested Margaret's attention. Even from a distance, she could see that they carried the weight of something heavy. She recognized that look because she saw it every morning in the mirror. But it wasn't the man who made her breath catch. It was the dog beside him. The German Shepherd was one of the most magnificent creatures Margaret had ever seen. Its coat was a perfect blend of black and tan, lustrous and well-maintained. The dog sat at perfect attention beside the man, its ears alert, its eyes scanning the park with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. Even from a distance, Margaret could sense the discipline in the animal, the training, the purpose. The dog wore a tactical vest, tactical. This was no ordinary pet. This was a working animal, a soldier in its own right. Margaret stopped walking. She stood there, leaning on her cane, watching the man and his dog. The man wore a Navy SEAL shirt, faded and well-worn. This wasn't just any man. This was someone who had served, someone who had seen things, done things that Margaret could barely imagine. And his dog, that dog wasn't just trained. It was bonded to him in a way that Margaret recognized as something sacred. For a moment, Margaret considered turning around, heading back the way she'd come. This man clearly had his own journey, his own burdens. She didn't want to intrude, didn't want to impose her loneliness on a stranger who was clearly dealing with his own darkness. But something held her in place. Something about the way the man's hand rested gently on the dog's head. Something about the loneliness that seemed to radiate from both man and animal in equal measure spoke to Margaret's heart in a language that transcended words. She thought about George. She thought about all the chances she'd passed up to connect with people, to allow others into her grief, to risk rejection or judgment or misunderstanding. And she thought about how very tired she was of being alone. Margaret took a breath and began walking forward again, moving toward the bench, toward the man, toward the dog. Her cane tapped steadily against the pavement. With each step, her heart beat faster, her courage grew and wavered and grew again. She didn't know this man. She didn't know if he wanted to be approached, but she also didn't know what would happen if she did. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret was curious about the future instead of terrified by it. She was walking toward a moment that would change both their lives forever, though she didn't know it yet. She was walking toward a conversation that would begin to heal wounds so deep that neither of them had believed healing was possible. She was walking toward a friendship that would transcend the ordinary boundaries of age and experience and circumstance. But in this moment, she simply walked, step by painful step, toward a stranger and his dog, toward an unknown future, toward something that her heart recognized as hope even if her rational mind couldn't quite believe it was real. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting dappled shadows across the path. A soft breeze carried the scent of flowers and salt air, and Margaret Torres, a 70-year-old widow who had been slowly dying of grief, took another step forward into the light. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. With each step closer to the bench, doubt crept into her mind like fog rolling in from the ocean. What was she doing? This was insane. This man didn't know her. He didn't want to be bothered by a limping old woman on a Tuesday morning. He had his dog, his solitude, his own private world of whatever struggles he carried in those haunted blue eyes. She should turn around. She should go back the way she came and pretend this moment had never happened. But her feet kept moving forward. The cane tapped against the pavement with each step, a steady rhythm that seemed to announce her approach like a metronome counting down to something momentous. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was louder in her ears than it should have been, amplified by her nervousness and her awareness of being observed. Because the man had noticed her. She could see it in the subtle shift of his shoulders, in the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the dog's head. His eyes had tracked her movement, assessing, evaluating, deciding whether she was a threat or merely a curious onlooker. The dog, magnificent, alert, disciplined, remained perfectly still, though Margaret could see his nostrils flare slightly as he caught her scent on the morning air. This was a working dog, trained to notice everything, to evaluate every stimulus. Margaret wondered what the dog made of her, an elderly woman with a cane, moving slowly, emitting the subtle scent of arthritis liniment and the faint perfume of lavender that she'd worn for 40 years. Margaret was now close enough to see the fine details of both man and animal. The man's face was deeply lined, the kind of lines that came not just from age but from squinting into difficult sunlight, from stress, from years of carrying responsibilities that weighed more than most people could imagine. His Navy SEAL shirt was worn soft from countless washings, the lettering slightly faded. His hands were large, calloused, with the kind of strength that came from physical work. But his expression was gentle as he looked at his dog, protective and tender in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. She stopped a few feet away from the bench, suddenly very aware of how she must look. Her hair, while clean, was pulled back in a simple bun. Her clothes were practical but worn. She hadn't bothered with fashion in months. Her face bore the marks of 70 years and 3 years of grief. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, nothing that should interest a man like this. He was probably wondering who this old woman was and why she'd invaded his space. "That's a beautiful dog," Margaret heard herself say, her voice softer than she intended. The man looked up at her, and for a moment his entire demeanor changed. His guarded expression softened, and his rigid posture relaxed slightly. His eyes, which had been distant and unfocused just moments before, came alive with something like recognition, not of her personally, but of her intention. She meant no harm. She was simply another lonely soul noticing his dog. "Thanks," he said, his voice deep and measured. "His name's Shadow." Shadow, of course. The name was perfect for this magnificent animal, strong, noble, ever-present. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. She was about to do something terrifying. She was about to step outside the carefully constructed boundaries she'd erected around herself. She was about to risk rejection, judgment, the possibility that this man would dismiss her and return to his solitude. But she also knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of decision, that if she turned away now, she would regret it for the rest of her life. "Can I sit with your K9 dog?" The question hung in the air between them, suspended like a feather caught between falling and floating. Margaret could hear her heartbeat in her ears. She could feel every one of her 70 years pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel the tremor in her hands where she gripped her cane. And she waited. The man studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. He was really looking at her, truly seeing her in a way that few people had bothered to in recent years. She could see the moment his defensive walls crumbled, not completely, but enough. Enough for him to recognize something in her, some shared experience of loss and isolation that transcended the difference in their ages, their backgrounds, their life experiences. Without speaking, he stood up. It was a graceful movement despite his size, fluid and controlled. "Please take my seat," he said gently. "I'm Marcus, Chief Marcus Webb." The gesture was simple, but it carried profound weight. He was giving her his place, his comfort. He was choosing to stand while she sat. He was honoring her question with action rather than words. Margaret slowly lowered herself onto the bench, acutely aware of how much effort the movement required. Her knees protested. Her back ached, But she made it down without falling, without completely embarrassing herself. And then Shadow moved. The dog shifted his massive body and placed his head directly on her lap. The weight of him was substantial, real, grounding. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached down to touch his fur. It was even softer than it looked, luxuriously silky under her weathered fingers. She expected the dog to pull away, to return to his handler, to resume whatever disciplined posture he'd been trained to maintain. But Shadow remained exactly where he was, his dark eyes looking up at her with an expression that seemed to contain infinite understanding. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She wasn't entirely sure why she was crying, whether from the sudden contact with a living creature, from the kindness of this stranger, from the overwhelming weight of 3 years of grief suddenly finding a crack through which to escape. Her shoulders shook slightly as she continued to stroke Shadow's fur, unable to speak, unable to do anything but feel. Marcus remained standing beside the bench, and importantly, he didn't try to fix her tears or comfort her with platitudes. He simply stood there, present, bearing witness to her emotion without judgment. It was perhaps the greatest gift he could have given her in that moment. After several minutes, Margaret found her voice. It was rough and raw, but it was hers. "Thank you," she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that her gratitude went far beyond the simple act of allowing her to pet his dog. She was thanking him for seeing her, for not dismissing her, for treating her with dignity, for offering her a moment of connection in a world that had felt increasingly disconnected. "He's a good judge of character," Marcus said quietly, his eyes on his dog. "He doesn't do that with everyone." Margaret looked down at Shadow, at the absolute trust and peace in the dog's expression, and something shifted in her chest. Something that had been locked away and frozen began to thaw. The dog's head remained on her lap, warm and heavy and real. And for the first time in 3 years, Margaret didn't feel completely alone. Marcus settled back onto the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she didn't feel abandoned. Shadow, caught between his two humans, seemed perfectly content to rest his head on Margaret's lap while his body remained in contact with Marcus. They sat like that as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, 3 beings, one old woman, one damaged warrior, and one noble dog, connected by circumstances that neither could have predicted and both would never forget. Nothing revolutionary was said. No great truths were exchanged. But in that silence on that bench, overlooking the Japanese friendship garden, 2 broken people and an extraordinary dog began the work of healing that would come to define the rest of their lives. The hours dissolved into an amber haze of conversation, silence, and the quiet presence of Shadow between them. Margaret's trembling hands never ceased their gentle stroking of the dog's soft fur, each touch grounding her further into reality, each connection to Shadow's warm body reminding her that she was alive, that she was present, that she mattered enough for a complete stranger to sit beside her on a park bench and simply be. At some point, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when, the tears came. They weren't violent sobs or dramatic outbursts. They were quiet tears that rolled down her weathered cheeks like water worn smooth by time, like her heart finally finding a safe place to release some of the burden it had been carrying alone. Margaret didn't try to hide them. She didn't apologize for them. She simply let them flow while her hands continued their gentle rhythm across Shadow's head and neck. Marcus didn't reach for his wallet to pull out a tissue. He didn't pat her on the back or offer empty reassurances that everything would be okay. He simply sat there, present and steady as a mountain, bearing witness to her grief without trying to minimize it or fix it. His left hand rested on Shadow's back, and the dog remained absolutely still, as if understanding that his primary job in this moment was to hold space for Margaret's pain. When Margaret finally found her voice, it came out rough and fractured, like a radio signal struggling to break through static. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she couldn't have said what she was apologizing for crying, for imposing herself on this stranger, for 3 years of grief that had transformed her into this shadow of a woman. "Don't apologize," Marcus said quietly, his voice gentle but steady. "There's nothing to apologize for." Margaret risked a glance at his face and saw that his expression held no judgment, no pity, only understanding. Somehow, that made it harder to maintain her composure, because pity she could have rejected. Understanding was far more dangerous. Understanding meant being truly seen. "I'm Margaret," she said, because names seemed important. Names were real. Names made people into humans instead of abstractions. "Marcus," he replied, even though she'd heard it before, "and this is Shadow." As if responding to his name, the dog lifted his head slightly and looked from Margaret to Marcus and back again, his dark eyes seeming to assess and approve the developing connection between his two humans. Then he settled his head back down on Margaret's lap with a contented sigh that seemed to carry the weight of wisdom. "He's extraordinary," Margaret said, running her fingers across the dog's ears. They were soft as velvet, alert as satellite dishes picking up signals from some distant world. "I can tell he's a working dog. Military." Marcus nodded slowly. "Navy, I recently retired from active duty. Shadow's been with me for 8 years. He was my partner, still is, really, just in a different capacity now." The way he said it, the subtle pause, the way his jaw tightened slightly, told Margaret that whatever his retirement from active duty had been, it had not been by choice. It had been something he'd been forced to accept, something he was still processing and grieving in his own way. "He's beautiful," Margaret said, and she meant it with the full weight of her heart. "And he clearly loves you very much." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not sure I deserve that love," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in those words struck Margaret with the force of a physical blow. This powerful man, this trained warrior, was sitting beside her carrying doubts about his own worthiness. And suddenly, Margaret understood something profound. Grief and trauma and loss weren't exclusive to elderly widows with arthritis. They came to everyone in different packages, with different labels, but the fundamental experience of pain was universal. "None of us deserve the love we receive," Margaret heard herself say. "That's what makes it love. If we deserved it, it would just be wages or payment. Love is what we get when we haven't earned it and don't deserve it. That's what my George used to say." Marcus turned to look at her fully then, his attention completely focused on her face, on her words, on the story she was beginning to tell. "George was your husband?" he asked gently. Margaret nodded, and the familiar tightness in her chest returned, that sensation of a fist clenching around her heart whenever she spoke about him in the past tense. She was learning that was a terrible word. It meant finality. It meant transformation from present to past. "For 42 years, she said. "He died 3 years ago, cancer. He was sick for 18 months and I was his primary caregiver, and then one morning I woke up and he was just gone, like he'd quietly stepped out of our life without even saying goodbye." The words tumbled out now, like stones rolling downhill, gathering momentum. Marcus listened without interrupting, without trying to insert his own experiences or minimize hers by relating his own pain. He simply listened, and Shadow remained a warm, living bridge between them, his presence somehow validating both their grief. Margaret found herself telling Marcus about George, the small details that mattered more than grand narratives. George's terrible jokes that made everyone groan. The way he always burned the toast because he read while making breakfast. His habit of falling asleep in his reading chair with his glasses slipping down his nose. The way he'd wake up and pretend he hadn't been asleep at all, as if fooling no one was somehow maintaining his dignity. "I miss him," Margaret said, and Shadow's tail thumped once against the bench, as if endorsing this admission of truth. "I miss him every single day. Some days I miss him so much that I can't breathe. Some days I wake up and forget that he's gone, and then I remember, and it's like losing him all over again." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion that he'd clearly been suppressing for a long time. "I've lost brothers in arms," he said slowly. "Men I served with, men I trusted with my life. I've watched them die. I've held them while they were dying, and I still can't talk about it without." His voice trailed off and he looked away, out toward the Japanese friendship garden where water fountains bubbled peacefully, indifferent to human suffering. "But shadow helps," Margaret said gently, understanding what he was trying to express. "Shadow helps," Marcus confirmed, his hand moving to rest on the dog's back. "He's the only being who knows what I've seen and doesn't judge me for surviving when others didn't. Survivor's guilt is real, and it's suffocating, and Shadow—" He paused, struggling for words. "Shadow just loves me anyway, without needing me to explain or justify or apologize." Margaret understood then why Shadow had come to her so readily, why he'd placed his head on her lap with such certainty. Shadow was a dog who understood loss and trauma and the crushing weight of living in a broken world. He was a dog who had been trained to sense the needs of his human, and in doing so, had learned to recognize pain in others. As the afternoon light began to shift, casting longer shadows across the park, Margaret and Marcus sat on that bench, barely moving, barely speaking, just existing in the presence of each other and Shadow. The dog had somehow created a space where both of them could be honest about their pain, could acknowledge their grief without shame, could sit with someone else who understood that healing wasn't linear and wasn't always possible. Sometimes it was just about learning to carry the weight a little bit more gracefully. When Margaret finally stood to leave, reluctantly, knowing that she had to respect Marcus's time and space, Shadow's head lifted, and his eyes tracked her movements with what seemed like concern. "Same time next week?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Marcus's face transformed with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but came close. "I'd like that very much," he said. "Same bench, same time." As Margaret limped away, her cane tapping against the pavement, she turned back once to see Marcus and Shadow watching her go. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt something that resembled hope, fragile and uncertain but real. The weeks that followed that first Tuesday became sacred in a way Margaret had never anticipated. She'd exchanged phone numbers with Marcus, though neither of them had discussed what exactly they were doing or what this connection meant. There was an unspoken agreement between them that such conversations weren't necessary. Some things existed beyond the need for definition or explanation. Some things simply were, and the greatest gift was to allow them to exist without trying to categorize or contain them. Tuesday and Friday became Margaret's entire world. She began planning her week around these 2 days, the way other people might plan around work or family obligations. On Mondays and Thursdays, she would prepare herself mentally, lay out her nicest casual clothes, a blouse without stains, slacks that still had some dignity to them, and take extra care with her appearance in a way she hadn't bothered with in 3 years. Her daughter, when they spoke on the phone, noted the change in her mother's voice. There was a brightness there, a cautious optimism that had been absent for so long that hearing it again made her daughter cry. "Mom, what's happening?" her daughter asked one evening. "You sound like yourself again. Are you? Is there someone?" Margaret laughed, actually laughed, something that felt rusty and strange in her chest. "There's someone, 2 someones actually, but not in the way you're thinking. I met a man at the park, a veteran and his dog, and we've become friends, I suppose. We meet twice a week." She could hear the concern in her daughter's voice, the protective instinct kicking in. "Mom, be careful. You don't know this man. He could be—" "He's broken," Margaret interrupted gently. "The same way I'm broken, and his dog is extraordinary, and I feel less alone. That's all that matters." The truth was more complicated than that, but Margaret didn't have the words to explain it. How could she describe the way her arthritis pain seemed to diminish when she had something to look forward to? How could she express the way her body seemed to move more fluidly, with more purpose, when she knew she would be seeing Shadow in just a few days? The physical benefits were undeniable. Her doctor had even commented on her improved gait during her last appointment. "Whatever you're doing," Dr. Reeves had said, reviewing Margaret's latest blood work, "keep doing it. Your markers have improved. Your pain medication use has decreased. Your overall health metrics are trending in a positive direction." What changed? "I made a friend," Margaret had replied simply. On the Tuesdays and Fridays that she met Marcus and Shadow, Margaret would arrive at the park a few minutes early. Her cane seemed lighter in her hand. The walk from her car to the bench seemed shorter. And then Marcus would be there, always at their bench, always with Shadow, always with coffee. Eventually he learned exactly how she liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, served in a ceramic mug instead of a paper cup because he said she deserved that small dignity. Shadow would greet her with the same enthusiasm every single time, his entire back end wiggling with joy, his tail wagging so hard it seemed to involve his entire body. And Margaret would sink onto the bench with a contented sigh, and Shadow would place his head on her lap, and for those hours, the world felt right in a way it hadn't in years. They developed rituals within their ritual. Every Tuesday, Marcus brought coffee and fresh pastries from a bakery downtown. Every Friday, Margaret brought homemade cookies, sugar cookies with frosting, oatmeal cookies with raisins, chocolate chip cookies that she'd learned to bake again just to have something to bring to their meetings. Marcus would eat too and save the rest to enjoy throughout his week. "These are incredible," he said one Friday, biting into a sugar cookie with frosting shaped like a dog bone. "You're going to spoil me. I'll expect these every week." "Then I'll make sure to bake them every week," Margaret replied, and the simple promise of continued meetings, of an understood future, brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. They began to do more than simply sit. They walked the park paths together, Margaret and Marcus flanking Shadow, who seemed to understand that his job was to maintain the pace Margaret could manage. The dog would glance back frequently, checking on her, adjusting his stride. Marcus would sometimes offer Margaret his arm and she would take it, and they would walk like that, 2 middle-aged and elderly people, a working dog between them, slowly circumnavigating the park in companionable silence. Other regulars began to recognize them. There was an older man who did Tai Chi every morning who would wave. A young mother with a stroller would smile knowingly. The park seemed to embrace them as a unit, as if everyone recognized that something important was happening on that particular bench, that some kind of healing was taking place. Marcus's nightmares decreased. He mentioned this one Friday as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I'm sleeping better," he said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone who had been given back something precious. "Last week I had 5 nights without nightmares, 5 nights where I slept more than 4 hours straight. I haven't done that I don't even know how long." Margaret squeezed his hand. "That's wonderful, Marcus, that really is." "You did that," he said, turning to look at her. "You and Shadow, something about having something to look forward to, having a reason to be present in the world. It changes things. It changes everything." Margaret joined a book club at her community center, something she would never have done before. She started volunteering at the local library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system. She called her daughter more frequently, actually listening to stories about her grandchildren instead of letting the conversations drift into silence. She bought new clothes. She got her hair done. She started living again, not because she decided to, but because having Marcus and Shadow in her life had made living seem like an activity worth engaging in. Marcus, too, had transformed. He started attending his veteran support group more regularly, eventually volunteering to facilitate a session. He got a small part-time job at a hardware store, nothing demanding, just enough to give him purpose and structure. He spoke less often about his guilt over surviving when his brothers hadn't, and when he did, there was a quality of acceptance to it, a recognition that survivor's guilt was something he would carry forever, but it didn't have to define him. One Friday, as they sat on their bench, Marcus reached over and took Margaret's hand. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact beyond the casual brushing of arms or shoulders that had become natural between them. His hand was warm and slightly rough, and Margaret's breath caught at the gesture's significance. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Margaret asked, though she understood. "For asking if you could sit with Shadow that first day, for being brave enough to approach a stranger, for seeing something in me worth knowing, for saving my life, really, though I know you don't think of it that way." Margaret turned her hand in his so that their palms met, so that the contact became mutual rather than one-directional. "You saved my life too," she said quietly. "I was dying, Marcus. Slowly, quietly, but I was dying. And you let me sit with your dog, and you listened to me talk about George, and you showed me that grief and loneliness didn't have to be solitary experiences. You gave me back my life." They sat like that, hands clasped, Shadow's head on both their laps now, the three of them connected in a way that went beyond words or explanation. The sun was setting, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. The park was emptying as evening approached, and on their bench, a 70-year-old woman and a 50-something veteran and a magnificent German shepherd sat together, no longer broken in isolation, but healing in community. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment, this simple moment of connection and mutual recognition, would become the foundation for something far greater than either of them could have imagined. This moment, and the ritual they had built around it, was about to ripple outward in ways that would change not just their lives, but the lives of many others struggling with the same loneliness, the same grief, the same desperate need to know that they weren't alone in their suffering. The Tuesday arrived without warning, like most crises do. Margaret had spent the morning preparing. She'd baked 24 fresh chocolate chip cookies, had laid out her favorite lavender blouse, had even treated herself to a manicure the day before. Her nails now painted a cheerful coral color that made her feel younger than she had in years. She'd arrived at their bench at their usual time, 8:45 in the morning, a full 15 minutes early as had become her custom. The bench was empty. At first, Margaret told herself that Marcus was simply running late. Traffic, a doctor's appointment, something mundane and explainable. She sat down carefully, her arthritic knees protesting slightly, and settled in to wait. Shadow would be here soon. Marcus would arrive, slightly breathless from hurrying, with coffee in hand and an apologetic smile on his face. Everything would be fine. 9:00 came and went, then 9:15, then 9:30. Margaret's stomach began to tighten. Her fingers, which had been relaxed in her lap, began to clench. She pulled out her phone, a device she used rarely and usually only to text with her daughter, and stared at Marcus's contact information. Should she call? Would that be intrusive? What if he was simply dealing with something and didn't want to be bothered? What if she was overstepping by expecting him to prioritize their meeting? By 9:45, Margaret had convinced herself of the worst. Marcus had changed his mind. He'd realized that spending time with a 70-year-old widow was a burden rather than a blessing. He'd found other companionship, other ways to manage his trauma that didn't involve sitting on a park bench with an old woman and her questions. He was probably relieved to have an excuse to stop coming. By 10:00, she was crying. She sat on the bench with her arms wrapped around herself, trying not to attract attention from the other park-goers, though by this point the early morning crowd had largely dispersed. An older woman passed and asked if she was all right. Margaret lied and said yes, just a little overwhelmed by the heat. The woman nodded sympathetically and continued on her way, and Margaret was left alone with her spiraling thoughts and her breaking heart. She called Marcus. Her hands shook as she scrolled through her phone to find his number. The call went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. What would she say? "Hi Marcus, it's Margaret. I'm sitting on a bench like an idiot, wondering if you've decided I'm not worth your time." That seemed pathetic and desperate. She texted instead, "Hi Marcus, I hope you're okay. I'm at the park, just wanted to check in." The message sat there unread for the next hour. By 11, Margaret had accepted the painful truth. This was it. The good thing in her life had ended as suddenly as it had begun. She was back to being alone, back to being the invisible widow shuffling through her days with no purpose and no connection. Shadow's head had not rested on her lap. Marcus's hand had not held hers. The future she'd been building in her mind, vague and undefined though it was, had evaporated like morning dew. She drove home in a daze, barely aware of the traffic around her, barely registering the red lights and stop signs. Once home, she sat in her kitchen and stared at nothing. Her untouched cookies sat on the counter, a monument to her foolish hopes. She thought about throwing them away, but even that felt like too much effort. The rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday passed in a fog of despair. Margaret didn't answer her phone when her daughter called. She didn't answer her door when the neighbor stopped by to invite her to a coffee morning. She simply lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had become so dependent on one person. When had she allowed herself to become so vulnerable? When had she forgotten the lesson that life had been trying to teach her for 3 years? That love and connection only led to pain and abandonment. On Wednesday night at 11:47 p.m. her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I need to talk to you. Can we meet tomorrow?" Margaret stared at the message, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. Relief warred with anger, with confusion, with desperate hope. She texted back, "I'll be at the bench at 9:00. She didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, imagining various scenarios. Had something happened to him? Had he been in an accident? Or was this the text of someone about to break off their friendship, trying to do it as kindly as possible? She swung between desperation and resignation, hope and despair, until the sun finally rose and she could stop pretending to sleep. Thursday morning, Margaret arrived at the park at 8:30. She didn't bring cookies. She didn't primp or prepare. She simply sat on the bench in her oldest clothes and waited for whatever was coming next. Marcus arrived at 9:15 and Margaret's breath caught at the sight of him. He looked devastated. His face was gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed, his posture defeated in a way she hadn't seen since that first day they'd met. Shadow was with him, but even the dog seemed subdued, his usual exuberance dimmed to a low hum. "I'm sorry," Marcus said immediately, sitting down beside her at a respectful distance. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. Tuesday night I had a really bad episode. A flashback, a trauma response, I'm not even sure what to call it. It hit me out of nowhere and I couldn't function. I couldn't face anyone. I couldn't even face you, and I should have, because you deserve better than silence." Margaret's anger evaporated. She understood, suddenly and completely, that Marcus's absence hadn't been a choice born of rejection or loss of interest. It had been the manifestation of his illness, the same way her withdrawal into her house would have been the manifestation of her grief. "What happened?" she asked quietly. "I was thinking about Smith," Marcus said, his voice rough. "One of my brothers. We served together for 12 years. He died in my arms, Margaret, and Tuesday I was just going about my day and suddenly I was back there. I could smell the dust. I could feel his blood on my hands. I could hear the sounds of gunfire, and I couldn't pull myself out of it. I spent all of Tuesday and most of Wednesday in bed, trying to just survive the next moment. Shadow stayed with me the whole time. He wouldn't leave me. He just lay beside me and kept me tethered to reality when my mind was trying to escape into the past." Margaret reached over and took his hand without hesitation. "You're here now," she said. "You showed up. That's what matters." "But what if I can't?" Marcus asked, and his voice broke. "What if there are more Tuesdays like that? What if I disappoint you again? I can't. Margaret, I can't lose you. You've become so important to me that the thought of losing you is almost as paralyzing as the flashbacks. And that terrifies me because I've learned that the things we love most can be taken away." Margaret understood then that Marcus had just confessed something profound. He was afraid of losing her because he loved her. Not romantically, necessarily, though she wasn't entirely certain about that either. He loved her in the way that two broken people love each other, with gratitude and recognition, and the knowledge that somehow, against all odds, they had found something that made living bearable. "Listen to me," Margaret said firmly, gripping his hand tighter. "When you didn't show up on Tuesday, I thought you'd abandoned me. I thought I'd lost the most important thing in my life. And it was the worst day I've had since George died. But then I realized something. I'd rather have you in my life with all your broken parts and your trauma and your bad days than not have you at all. So yes, there will probably be more difficult Tuesdays, but we'll get through them, together, with Shadow, the three of us." Marcus turned to look at her fully, and tears streamed down his face. "How did we get here?" he asked. "3 months ago I was a stranger on a park bench. You were a widow asking if you could pet my dog. And now you're the most important person in my life besides my family," Margaret finished. "And I'm not letting you go. Not because everything is perfect, but because it's real. Because we're real." Shadow, sensing the emotional intensity, pressed his massive head against both of them, creating a physical anchor that held them together. And sitting on that bench, with a dog between them and the morning sun warming their faces, Marcus and Margaret made an unspoken covenant with each other. They would show up, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. The transformation that began after Marcus's crisis rippled outward in ways neither he nor Margaret could have predicted. What had started as a private healing between two broken people began to quietly reshape the world around them, one person at a time. It started subtly, with questions, with observations, with the visible evidence of two people finding wholeness through connection. Marcus attended his veteran support group the following Tuesday. It was the first time he'd shown up in weeks, and the members of the group noticed immediately. There was a lightness to him that hadn't been present before, a sense of groundedness that seemed almost foreign on someone who had spent so long teetering on the edge of despair. "You look different, Webb," said David, a fellow veteran who had served with Marcus and had been struggling with similar issues. "What changed?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how to articulate the transformation without sounding foolish. These were hardened soldiers, men who understood trauma and pain, and the struggle to exist in a world that didn't make sense anymore. They wouldn't judge him, but they also wouldn't understand the almost spiritual quality of his healing unless he explained it carefully. "I met someone," Marcus finally said, "an older woman, 70 years old. She's a widow dealing with her own grief. And I have a dog, Shadow. He's a working dog, trained emotional support animal. This woman approached me in the park and asked if she could sit with my dog, and something about that moment, about her courage to reach out, about Shadow's response to her, it changed something in me." The room fell silent. Several of the men exchanged glances. Then David leaned forward. "You're saying a dog helped you?" he asked, not mockingly but with genuine curiosity. "Not just the dog," Marcus clarified. "The woman, the connection, the permission to be broken in front of someone else and have them stay anyway. The reminder that I'm not the only one suffering, that my pain doesn't disqualify me from being loved or cared for." Within days, the story began to spread through the veteran community. Men started asking Marcus about this woman, about Shadow, about how a chance encounter in a park had somehow managed to pull a fellow soldier back from the brink. Marcus found himself talking about Margaret and their meetings not as a private treasure, but as something worth sharing, worth replicating, worth understanding as a potential model for healing. Meanwhile, Margaret's transformation was equally visible in her own circles. She joined a book club at the community center, and the women there couldn't help but notice the change in her. The Margaret who had shuffled in 3 months ago, quiet, withdrawn, barely present, had transformed into someone engaged, interested, alive. "Margaret, you're glowing," said Patricia, one of the book club members, during their weekly coffee. "What's going on? Have you met someone?" Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I have, a veteran and his dog. We meet in the park twice a week, and it saved my life, honestly. I was dying and I didn't even know it. But sitting with his dog, listening to his stories, sharing my own grief, it's reminded me that I'm still alive, that there's more to life than just enduring the absence of the people we love. The women leaned in, fascinated. Patricia, who had lost her own husband 6 years ago and had never fully recovered, felt something crack open inside her chest. If Margaret could find this kind of connection, could find a reason to smile again, maybe there was hope for her too. "Could I," Patricia hesitated, "could I come with you sometime to meet this person and his dog?" Margaret's eyes widened. She hadn't expected her personal healing journey to become something that others wanted to join. But the idea of expanding their circle, of allowing others to experience what she and Marcus had discovered, felt right somehow. It felt like the natural next step. "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "Come this Friday. We meet at Balboa Park on the bench overlooking the Japanese Friendship Garden, 9 o'clock. When Margaret mentioned Patricia to Marcus on their Thursday evening call, she could hear the smile in his voice. "I think that's a good idea," he said. "I've been thinking about this a lot, Margaret. What we have, what we've created together, it feels too important to keep to ourselves. It feels like something that could help other people." By the following Friday, there were 5 people on and around their bench: Margaret, Marcus, Shadow, Patricia, and an older gentleman named Raymond who had overheard Patricia talking about the park meetings and had decided to show up. Raymond was a widower like Margaret, and he hadn't smiled, truly smiled, in over a decade. Shadow, sensing the shifting dynamics, seemed to expand his capacity for connection. The dog moved from person to person, allowing each of them to touch him, to feel his warm presence, to experience the non-judgmental companionship that a working dog offered to those in pain. And something remarkable happened. As each person touched Shadow, they began to open up. Walls came down. Stories emerged. Raymond talked about his wife. Patricia spoke about the loneliness that had nearly consumed her. An elderly woman named Alina, who had simply been walking past, stopped to ask about Shadow and ended up sitting on the bench for 2 hours, tears streaming down her face as she shared her own story of loss. Marcus watched this unfold with a sense of awe. What had been an intimate healing between 2 people had somehow become a circle of healing. He looked at Margaret across Shadow's massive head, and she met his eyes with understanding. They had stumbled onto something profound, something that the world needed. Over the following weeks, the Tuesday and Friday meetings at Balboa Park began to grow organically. Word spread through veteran support groups, through church communities, through book clubs and senior centers. People came for Shadow but stayed for the connection. A struggling young veteran named James came because his therapist suggested it. An elderly woman named Dorothy came because her daughter was worried about her depression. A man named Robert came because his best friend had died, and he didn't know how to live without him. By the end of that month, there were regularly 15 to 20 people gathered around and near the bench, some sitting, some standing, all of them touching Shadow at various points, all of them sharing their stories with people who understood, who didn't judge, who simply held space for their pain. Marcus and Margaret made a decision together. What had begun as a chance encounter needed structure, needed intention, needed to be developed into something sustainable. They started researching emotional support animal programs. They reached out to therapists and social workers. They began laying the groundwork for what would become the Shadow Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to pairing rescue dogs with isolated seniors and struggling veterans. "We're going to change lives," Margaret said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "Not just our own lives, but so many others." Marcus squeezed her hand. "We already are," he said. "Look around. Look at James. He hasn't had a flashback since he started coming here. Look at Alina. She started volunteering at the library. Look at David. He proposed to his girlfriend last week and told me it was because you reminded him that life is worth living." The impact of their simple act of connection had begun to ripple outward in ways they couldn't have anticipated. A 70-year-old widow had asked a Navy SEAL if she could sit with his dog, And that single moment of courage had set off a chain reaction of healing that was transforming not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. Shadow remained at the center of it all, a four-legged miracle who had somehow understood before anyone else that what these broken people needed was not pity or advice or treatment, but simply presence. Simple, unconditional healing presence. 6 months after that first serendipitous encounter, Margaret and Marcus stood in a modest office space in downtown San Diego, staring at the freshly printed certificate of incorporation for the Shadow Foundation. The document was simple, just legal language and signatures, but it represented something far more profound, the transformation of personal healing into communal purpose. Margaret held the certificate with trembling hands, and Marcus stood beside her with his arm around her waist, both of them aware that they were witnessing the official birth of something that would outlive them both. "We did it," Margaret whispered, though it felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Behind them, in the window of their modest office, sat Shadow. The dog had become something of a local legend. News outlets had picked up their story. The San Diego Tribune had run a feature titled, "A Dog Named Shadow Changes 2 Lives and Transforms a Community." Social media had amplified their message. Their inbox overflowed with emails from people across the country asking how they could replicate the Shadow Foundation model in their own cities. That evening, Margaret and Marcus sat on their favorite bench at Balboa Park. The sunset was particularly spectacular, the sky a masterpiece of crimson and gold and violet, as if the universe itself was celebrating their accomplishment. Shadow lay peacefully between them, his head resting on Marcus's lap while his tail occasionally brushed against Margaret's leg. Around them, the park was emptying as evening fell, but earlier that day, 43 people had gathered at their bench and the surrounding area. 43 people who had come seeking healing, seeking community, seeking proof that they weren't alone in their suffering. "I've been thinking about something," Margaret said, her hand finding Marcus's in the gathering darkness. "About what this all means. A year ago I was sitting in my house, waiting to die. I'd given up on living. I'd given up on finding meaning or purpose. And then you and Shadow appeared in my life and everything changed." Marcus turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight. "You changed everything," he said softly. "You had the courage to approach a stranger. You had the vulnerability to ask. If you hadn't asked if you could sit with Shadow, I'd probably be in a very different place right now. A darker place." "Do you think it was coincidence?" Margaret asked. "That I chose that particular morning to go to the park, that you chose that particular bench to sit on?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he finally said, "that when two broken people are desperate enough, lost enough, open enough to their pain, sometimes the universe conspires to bring them together. I think grief and loneliness have a way of calling out to each other across distances and time. And I think Shadow has always understood what humans sometimes forget, that we're not meant to suffer alone." That night back at Marcus's apartment, they spread out the plans for the Shadow Foundation's expansion. Over the past 6 months, they've been working quietly with therapists, veterinarians, dog trainers, and social workers to develop a comprehensive program. The foundation would identify rescue dogs with natural empathy and intelligence, dogs like Shadow who seem to understand human pain on an almost supernatural level. These dogs would be trained as emotional support animals, and then paired with either isolated seniors or struggling veterans. The foundation would provide counseling, support groups, and community gatherings like their park meetings, but the heart of the program would always be the connection between human and animal. "We've already received commitments from 5 other cities," Margaret said, reviewing the emails on her laptop. "Portland wants to start a program, so does Austin. There's interest from New York and Los Angeles and Seattle. Marcus, we're going to be able to help hundreds of people." Marcus pulled up a chair beside her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Look at this one," he said, pointing to an email from a woman in North Carolina. "She's a widow like you. Her name is Catherine. She read about us and decided to approach a veteran with a dog at her local park. She's asking us how to start a Shadow Foundation chapter in her area." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "She's going to save someone's life the way we saved each other's lives," Margaret whispered. "And they're going to help others. It's like we're creating circles of healing that will keep expanding and expanding." "Ripples," Marcus said. "That's what you called it once. One woman asked one Navy SEAL if she could sit with his dog, and it created ripples that are spreading out across the entire country." Over the following months, the Shadow Foundation grew beyond their wildest expectations. They hired a small staff. They established partnerships with animal rescue organizations and veteran support groups. They developed training protocols for emotional support dogs and mental health counseling programs to accompany the animals. News of their work spread through social media, through word of mouth, through the testimonials of people whose lives had been transformed by a dog and a community of fellow sufferers. Margaret received a call one afternoon from the mayor of San Diego's office. The city wanted to honor her and Marcus with a community service award. The ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in the park, not at their bench, but in an open area where hundreds of people could gather. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and felt the weight of responsibility and gratitude settle on her shoulders like a familiar cloak. "A year ago," she said, her voice steady despite her tears, "I didn't think I had anything left to give to the world. I was a widow in pain, isolated, just trying to survive each day. And then I met a Navy SEAL named Marcus and his extraordinary dog Shadow. That meeting saved my life. But more importantly, it taught me something crucial, that our deepest wounds, our most profound pain, can become the source of our greatest healing, not just for ourselves, but for others." She paused, looking out at the crowd. She could see Patricia, the book club member who had asked to join them that first Friday. Patricia was now heading the Shadow Foundation's fundraising efforts. She could see James, the young veteran who had been suicidal when he first came to the park. James had recently gotten engaged and had volunteered to help train the next batch of emotional support dogs. She could see Alina, the woman who had cried for 2 hours at the bench, now smiling as she held the leash of a rescue dog she'd been paired with through the foundation. "The Shadow Foundation isn't about dogs," Margaret continued. "It's about understanding that we all carry wounds, we all carry grief, and we all deserve to know that we don't have to carry those burdens alone. We deserve community. We deserve connection. We deserve to sit on a bench with someone who understands our pain, with an animal that loves us unconditionally, and simply be. That's what the Shadow Foundation is about, creating spaces where broken people can gather and heal together." When the ceremony ended and Marcus and Margaret received their awards, Shadow was brought up on stage. The dog seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He stood between his two humans, calm and noble, the physical embodiment of the healing they had created together. Photographers captured the moment. An elderly woman in a lavender blouse, a middle-aged veteran in dress uniform, and a magnificent German shepherd, all standing in the sunlight, all connected by invisible threads of love and purpose, and the shared understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of service come not from grand gestures, but from simply showing up and sitting with someone in their pain. That evening, Marcus and Margaret sat on their bench one final time before beginning to train the next handlers who would take over the park meetings. Shadow rested between them, and Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A simple question asked by a courageous widow. A Navy SEAL willing to be vulnerable. A dog who understood before anyone else that connection was the antidote to loneliness. "I'm proud of us," Marcus said quietly. "So am I," Margaret replied. "Not because we created this foundation or because we're changing lives or because the mayor gave us an award, but because we had the courage to be honest about our pain. We had the courage to reach out to a stranger. We had the courage to let ourselves be loved and to offer love in return." As the sun began to set for what seemed like the 10,000th time on that bench, Margaret rested her head on Marcus's shoulder. Shadow's tail thumped contentedly against the ground, and in that moment in the gathering darkness, they understood the profound truth that had carried them through their darkest days and would continue to carry them forward. That sometimes salvation comes quietly, unexpectedly, in the form of a simple question, a stranger's kindness, and a dog's unconditional love. Sometimes the greatest heroes wear fur and four legs. Sometimes the greatest acts of service come not from trying to change the world, but from simply showing up and sitting with someone in their pain, allowing them to know, in the deepest part of their being, that they are not alone. The ripples continued outward from that bench, spreading across the country, changing lives, creating communities, transforming grief into purpose and isolation into connection. And it all began with one woman brave enough to ask a simple question: "Can I sit with your K9 dog?" The answer was yes, and that yes changed everything.